I am Christopher Smith, and this is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where is the church going?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything.
Welcome to Special Edition Episode 38 of the Naked Mormonism Podcast, the Serial Mormon History Podcast. Today is Thursday, January 26th, 2017. My name is Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. Today's episode is packed with a discussion with a very special guest. It's not very often that we get Mormon historians on the show, so whenever they do, we really got to rake them over the coals and, learn as much as possible from them. So, if you are a supporter at patreon.com/nakedmormonism, I have to say thank you very much, and also be sure to check out this episode on Patreon, because you get an extra segment. I had to ask Chris a couple of questions that we couldn't really fit into the regular discussion, and, it was really interesting to get his thoughts on the entheogen use in the history of the church. So be sure to check out the Patreon edition, and without further ado, this is my interview with Christopher C. Smith. Should I say Professor Christopher C. Smith? All right, today I am joined by Christopher C. Smith, who has been making waves in the studies of Mormon history, essentially since he began, quite a few years ago in high school studying it. He's been writing on it, studying it, and is now officially, I should introduce him as Dr. Chris Smith, Professor of Religion at the University of Utah, beginning in February. He just finished his thesis defense. And his thesis is something we're going to talk a lot about, but I'm just super stoked to have him on the show. Chris, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you very much, Bryce. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. And I appreciate you taking a little bit of time to talk today, because you're most of the people that I've been reading from in Mormon history, we're talking H. Michael Marquardt, D. Michael Quinn, the Tanners, people that have been studying this for decades and have been writing, massive tomes of knowledge on stuff like this. But you're kind of the up and coming generation of Mormon scholars, and I'm just so curious, what got you interested in Mormon history?
Well, back in high school, I was a young, zealous evangelical Christian, and the kids at school, on the whole, were not very religious, except for the Mormon kids. And so the Mormon kids were the ones that I really was drawn to, and I briefly dated-ish the bishop's daughter.
Okay.
So we were kind of trying to convert each other, and that didn't work out, but I got sort of hooked on Mormon history because I did a whole bunch of research about it and found out about Joseph Smith and polygamy and all the fun stuff in Mormon history. I always tell my Mormon friends, you guys have like the most fascinating religious history in the world, and I feel like I can't really tell most of my Mormon friends like that because they would be traumatized.
It's kind of a different experience talking to Mormon scholars versus just the typical chapel Mormon about Mormon history. Am I right?
It is very different. When I am in Utah, I have a very self-selected friend network, so I think I don't experience Utah quite the way that Mormon folks do.
I see. So this was back in, and when was this that you were in high school starting to study these types of things?
Oh boy, let's see. I graduated in 2003, so it's been a while.
And then from there, you went on to, is this Fresno Pacific University for Biblical Studies? Is that right?
Yeah, it's a Mennonite school, and I was originally intending to go into the ministry, so I got a degree in Bible. And
so you had to like read by candlelight too, right?
No.
So not that hardcore Mennonite then.
No, actually, the West Coast Mennonites are very progressive. It was an interesting experience, but they do have a relief sale every year where all the Amish folks come out and they've got their Germanic beards and they ask you what your last name is because they're hoping that they'll be related to you somehow. And I actually grew kind of a nice, like, German-looking Mennonite beard one year for the sale, so I fit in.
That's amazing. And they're like, "Oh, you're a Smith. Oh, I know a dozen Smiths in my life." It's like, yeah, look at a phone book. Like 90% of it is Smiths. So
yeah, pretty much, yeah.
Okay. And then from then you went on to Wheaton College, is that right?
Yeah, and Wheaton College is kind of a fundamentalist school, and it's a little weird that I went there because by the time I went there, I was kind of on my way out of Christianity. But it was a good experience. They have a really strong history of religions program there, and that's kind of what I was transitioning into from Bible as I decided if I wasn't going to do ministry, then sort of the other obvious thing to do was kind of transition into history because it kind of let me use some of my training. And then from there I went to CGU, which is where I just graduated with my PhD in religion. And I emphasized there in North American religions and history of Christianity. And they have a Mormon studies program there. So I had the opportunity to study under Richard Bushman, who's sort of the premier Mormon historian, and that was really awesome. He was super supportive and just loved working with him.
Wow, that's fantastic. Yeah, I know Richard Bushman, recently there was a video posted of him talking about essentially the problems in the Mormon church's narrative, the Salt Lake City LDS church's narrative of their history, and that they're going to have to make changes pretty soon. You know, this is a guy who, I mean, he's been writing on this stuff forever, right? I mean, he's been in his studies for decades. I mean, the guy has done an incredible body of research, and to be studying right under it, man, I'm jealous to have, ready access to such an intellectual tower like him. It's amazing.
It was great. And he is an intellectual power, not only in terms of the power of his mind, but also in terms of the power of his connection. I mean, the name Richard Bushman can get you in a lot of doors. Right. And yeah, the special thing about Richard is, he's been an apologist, and he's also been, kind of a progressive, pushing the envelope a little bit. And so he's right there in the middle where he has credibility on both sides, and he can kind of make everybody a little bit uncomfortable and and get away with it, and actually get a hearing. And so he, despite, having written a bunch of apologetic stuff, he really has been the pioneer in the new ethos at the Church History Library, where they're starting to be more open and transparent. They're opening up the archives so that researchers like me can get access to all kinds of juicy stuff that we never would have seen before. And he's kind of pushing the inoculation program, where they're sort of trying to put out the essays and acknowledge difficult issues and teach church members about it in church or in the church context, at least, through the church website, so that people know about these issues.
And not hide from these issues too, because they've been trying to do that for a long time. And then when somebody brings up, let's say the seer stones, oh yeah, we've known about that forever. It's like, why hasn't that been taught? But having somebody like Richard Bushman kind of on the forefront that's dragging the church, essentially kicking and screaming through their own history and saying, we have to talk about this. We need to publish essays on it. I think that's an invaluable asset to have on both sides of the spectrum,
It really is. It really is. I mean, he's made it possible for people like me who are, inclined to the salacious details and the weird stuff in Mormon history to have more credibility. I can push the envelope a little bit further, even out on kind of the extremes of Mormon history, because he's pushing the envelope a little bit further in the middle. The further sort of left the middle moves, the further left those of us who are out on the left can move.
Wow. So, yeah, I never thought of it really that way, but yeah, that's a perfect way to illustrate how it seems the vast body of Mormon research is going nowadays. I mean, you always have the firebrands and whatnot, like the Tanners on one side, who are saying it's all, essentially blasphemy. You're going to go to hell if you follow the Mormon church. And, having somebody like Richard Bushman that is legitimizing their actual research, not necessarily their faith claims or whatever, but their actual research. It's like, that's, I think a breath of fresh air for those who have known about a lot of these contradictory problems in the history, but haven't been able to talk about it, or haven't had somebody to go to that's on their side, that's on the believing spectrum, that they can, kind of fall back on as a legitimate resource that's still a believer. He's, if I'm not mistaken, he's tenured a few professorships at BYU and stuff like that. I mean, he's done a lot of work. Like I said, it's invaluable to have him as an asset for both sides. But let's go ahead and take that and jump back more kind of to you and how you or why the topic of Mormonism interests you. Obviously there is, as you said, the salacious topics in Mormon history that are fun to talk about. But a lot of people don't seem to know about. But I mean, the reason I'm so fascinated in Mormon history is because it was the culture I was raised in. But I sense, you didn't really have that kind of connection to the history and getting into it. It seems like you're studying it from a more objective perspective in my mind.
Well, I hope so. I certainly try to. I think that what really hooked me on Mormon history is that I have always been a very trusting person. I have always been somebody who really sort of kind of assumes that the truth lies in the middle of the road. And I try to be very diplomatic with people and give people the benefit of the doubt and everything. But I have had some experiences in my life that have really flown in the face of that. And where I have felt that the evidence really points to kind of an extreme interpretation, and the people who are hewing to the center are actually perpetuating a kind of bias in their own.
Okay. Is there an example you could think of that we could apply to this?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the political climate right now, I think actually the truth about Donald Trump is scarier than a lot of people realize. And I think that there's a lot of sort of a tendency to assume that the truth is in the middle, the sort of like the false balance in the news media, where they try to sort of present both sides, but both sides are not actually equally justified. And I think that where this bias really comes in is when you're dealing with personality disorders. Because with 98% of the population, the truth is going to be in the middle of the road, because most people are, have a lot of good and bad mixed up in them. They have selfless motives and selfish motives, and they act kind of in different ways depending on the circumstances. But when you're dealing with somebody who has a personality disorder, they engage in all sorts of extreme behaviors, and they don't really have remorse, and they don't really have empathy, and right. Often they're so far removed from anything expected.
Yeah, exactly. The expected social norms just kind of fly out the window when you're talking to a person like, let's say Donald Trump. I don't like to jump into politics too much on this show. I like to keep it essentially devoid, but I think we can maybe apply that. So like maybe, with Brian Hale's claims of, Joseph's, let's say his relations with some of, other men's wives. I mean, I've heard Brian Hale's. I've watched Dan Vogel's most recent videos on Joseph Smith with other women or other men's wives. I can't talk for some reason, and he does talk about Brian Hale's specific claims about whether or not Joseph had sexual relations with some of the women. Now, while that really shouldn't matter so much, it does matter when somebody is saying that I am the prophet, I am chaste, I can't find, more than one wife, when he's standing in front of the Relief Society with 30 women that were his wives in the congregation. Right. I mean, so maybe talking about an extreme there. Maybe the truth really isn't in the middle. It's like maybe, Joe probably had sexual relations with a fair number of these women, but it's not like there's really evidence to point to that. It just seems like that the preponderance of evidence of, the scant evidence that we can find of this tends to drag the more extreme conclusion that he was having many, 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 many extramarital relations into being a little more true. It's not just middle of the road, right?
Right. I mean, people didn't really talk about sex in the 19th century in an open way, and so we wouldn't expect to find a lot of really explicit evidence. But I think that the implicit evidence points very clearly to Joseph Smith having been, this very sexual creature. And, I think that to assume that the truth is somewhere in the middle, or that we should sort of err on the side of giving him the benefit of the doubt when all of his behavior suggested he didn't warrant the benefit of the doubt, that actually he had a serious personality disorder, it's a mistake.
Fair enough. So, I mean... I guess it's important to get all sides of the story, listen to all of the scholars and people that are studying this, and maybe make our own judgments based on the evidence that we have. And, given what evidence are claimed by, let's say, Dan Vogel as opposed to Brian Hales on the relations of these women with Joseph Smith, it's worth reading and understanding what both scholars are saying on the topics, and kind of coming to our own skeptical conclusions about whether or not either side holds more merit or less merit in that case.
Absolutely. I mean, I always advocate, taking into account all of the evidence and, not making claims beyond what the evidence warrants. When I look at Joseph Smith, I see a pattern of behavior. And so evidence that if I were talking about anyone else, I might not take certain claims very seriously. I might assume that certain claims were anti-Mormon propaganda. But when I look at Joseph Smith and I see this pattern, and the claims that the anti-Mormons are making are fitting the pattern, then I take those claims a lot more seriously.
Absolutely. Maybe that's a good jumping off point to discuss the timeline that the show is currently sitting at, and that is 1838. Of course, there's so much that has happened up to this point that led essentially what we might call mob violence in Missouri to be what it was. And there's, a number of variable factors that we have to take into account there. But, 1838 seems like a particularly confusing time in the timeline that I've studied up to this point, because it seems like there's just so much going on at multiple different locations, and they're all influenced by rumors that are coming out of those locations. I mean, what's going on in DeWitt is heavily influenced by the rumors that are coming out of Davies and what is actually happening there. What Boggs is hearing down in Richmond is different than what is actually going on up in Caldwell County. Like, this is just an absolute chaos time in my mind. And I'm hoping maybe through your studying, we can gain a little bit more perspective on this time, 1838. Are you fairly familiar with this time? Can you help us out a little bit here?
Yeah, I did some research, particularly on the Danites. So I don't know that I'm an expert on the entire Mormon War, but certainly with regard to the secret militancy that was going on in the Danite circles, I've done some research into that. So if you're interested in talking about that, we can definitely get into it.
Yeah, because the Danites, that was one of the main things that was scaring so many Missourians, was the Mormons. Not only were they moving in and buying up as much land as they possibly could, or, well, essentially squatting on land as much as they possibly could, they had this organized hit squad, the Danites. Like, that's intimidating. That's a really scary time, right? So yeah, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the Danites in 1838.
Yeah, so the interesting thing about the Danites is that they were probably formally organized in Missouri, but they actually go back a little bit into Kirtland, because the sort of ethos of the Danites was already there in Kirtland. And I think that a lot of historians have assumed that Joseph Smith got radicalized by being driven out of Kirtland, and then expressed that radicalism through the Danite organization in Missouri. But I actually think that Joseph Smith was radical very, very early in his career, and that we can see that radicalism all the way through. So
really?
maybe I'll start by saying something about the Kirtland Danites.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, weren't they originally organized as like the Brother of Gideon Society? Something to that effect?
Well, the Brother of Gideon actually, I think, was Gideon Carter, and Jared Carter was the first Captain General of the Danites. And so he was sort of second in command of the Danite organization, and he was sort of the strong man who was enacting all of the violence. And so you get Sidney Rigdon preaching about how the terrible brother of Gideon is going to come and, take away the dissenters and, punish them. And a couple people report on that, one of whom is Reed Peck, who says the brother of Gideon was Jared Carter, because Jared Carter's brother was named Gideon Carter. And then you get, I think it was either John Whitmer or W.W. Phelps, who assumed that the brother of Gideon was a term for the entire organization, but I actually don't think that's true. I think it was kind of a code name for just Jared Carter.
Interesting. But I mean, that was essentially the archetype, Jared Carter himself was essentially like the archetype for them needing to have an enforcement squad, right?
Well, he was the leader of the organization, and so he sort of stood for the whole organization in Rigdon's preaching. I think, Rigdon talks about Jared Carter doing it, but of course it's mostly going to be Jared Carter's henchmen who are actually carrying out his orders. But yeah, okay. I mean, if you think about the Mormon scriptures referring to the brother of Jared, so Gideon Carter would have been the brother of Jared, and therefore Jared is the brother of Gideon. It's kind of like a play on scriptural terms.
Right, of course. Back to the Jaredites. So there was something you said earlier. I'm curious about this. You said that you think Joe was essentially radicalized pretty early on. What would you point to that may, that kind of substantiates that claim?
Well, the Book of Mormon talks about the Lamanites sort of destroying the Gentiles and being like a roaring lion tearing them apart. Mm-hmm. That's pretty radical rhetoric. You get a lot of references in the Book of Mormon to things like class and inequality. I think Joseph Smith had a lot of kind of resentment about being poor. And it comes out in his... I actually think that there was some theft that went on in Mormonism fairly early on. But it also comes out through the Kirtland Bank, where he's basically kind of printing his own money and seeing it, I think, as kind of taking advantage of the financial system and the lax regulation of banking and stuff to make some money for the kingdom. And he uses kind of coded language in the scriptures. He says, for instance, that he wants some people to marry Lamanite wives or to, get licenses to trade with the Lamanites, basically in order to sneak onto the reservation because the government was preventing Mormon missionaries from going onto the reservation. And he uses this interesting language when he says that. He says, it is wisdom. And he's always kind of using wisdom in like this winking way, like it's, God sort of allows us to be cunning in our dealings with the Gentiles because in service of the kingdom, because it's sort of the kingdom is kind of at war with the Gentiles. And I think that to understand what Joseph Smith is doing, you have to understand that perception that he really sees himself throughout his career as being kind of at war with the Gentiles, both in an overt way in the Missouri War, but also in this covert kind of paramilitary, clandestine, secret agency kind of way through organizations like the Danites and the Nauvoo Police.
Interesting that these secret combinations start cropping up in the church when they run into financial problems, but they're, wholly denounced throughout the Book of Mormon multiple times. Talks about the the Gadianton robbers and these other secret combinations that are undermining the government and whatnot. It's but Joe really didn't seem to have much of an issue about forming his own secret combination. and many variations of it as well. I mean, starting with maybe pointing back to like the School of the Elders back in 1833, like that was essentially like a secret cabal of the leaders of the church. And they didn't, they performed their various, washing and anointings and didn't really let anybody else in. So maybe that's just something that Joe was more predisposed to, was just, creating like a shadow society to affect his will, right?
Yeah, he was always doing things in secret. And that thing about, the Book of Mormon denouncing secret combinations has always fascinated me, because the Danites almost seem to be modeled on the Gadiantans. Like, they're so similar. He can't not have thought about the fact that this was basically the Gadianton robbers that he was setting up here.
Right, of course.
They were designed as a criminal organization. He had people literally swearing to not only follow all of his orders, but to kill dissenters and, get each other out of trouble, even to the point of committing perjury before a Gentile court. Mm-hmm. It's intense. It's very much like a caricature of the Freemasons. Both the Gadiantans and the Danites are basically like caricatures of the Freemasons. And I think Joseph Smith was just fascinated by Freemasonry. I think he was drawn to it all along. And I've thought about this question a lot and worked out kind of several possible interpretations of what he was doing. Everything from, maybe he was providing himself some kind of cover for the things that he wanted to do by denouncing them so vehemently in public, which is something that we see him doing with polygamy as well.
Right.
Or maybe he genuinely was kind of battling his demons, working out his issues in the Book of Mormon, but they sort of get the better of him later on in life, and he ultimately kind of changes his mind about it. So this is why I find Mormonism so compelling, is that there are these weird paradoxes in Joseph Smith's character, and I'm trying to figure out what the heck was going on with this guy.
Oh, yeah. Well, and I think we all are. And I would say, from what I understand myself, I would say Joe was conniving, he was devious by all means. He didn't mind orchestrating large plans in order to carry out an idea or, some compelling thought that he had. But I do see a bit of a change in the rhetoric that was spoken from the pulpit once they're chased out of Kirtland. I mean, that's when we see the Salt Sermon coming out and Sidney Rigdon's 4th of July oration, and Joe saying that, calling the Missourians, damned mobocrats and stuff. I mean, that's when I start to see that he's not really just spouting stuff at the pulpit anymore. He's actually claiming, well, I don't know how else to put it, but he's essentially becoming a demagogue, right? A leader of this clandestine group of these enforcers, these Danites, and he's spewing stuff from the pulpit that is, non-idle death threats. They are just very explicit death threats. Sidney Rigdon saying from the pulpit that if a sheriff comes into this town, we will kill him. And a person said, are you sure? You mean like kill his character? And Rigdon was like, no, I mean that lump of meat above his shoulders. Like I think the death threats weren't really present from what I've seen until, early 1838 comes along and they're running into problems in Missouri. But that's my own perspective.
Let me actually push back on that, because Grandison Newell, who was...
Yeah.
He was a kind of an anti-Mormon opponent of the church. He sued Joseph Smith several times throughout the Kirtland period.
13 of them or something. Yeah, he was the anti-Mormon. He was friends with Eber Howe, if I'm not mistaken, too, right?
He was, yeah. He was involved with Hurlbut as well. And Joseph Smith basically tells several of his followers that God wants them to go and kill Grandison Newell. And this is supported by a surprising amount of testimony, and we have the kind of a newspaper report of the court trial, and we can see exactly what one of the would-be assassins said, Joseph Smith said to him. And it sounds a lot like the sort of things that Sidney Rigdon says in Missouri and that Joseph Jackson reports Joseph Smith saying about Governor Boggs during the Nauvoo period. He uses a lot of the same kinds of arguments, according to Solomon Denton. And then we have sort of second-hand accounts from a couple of other people, Marvel Davis being one of them. And Marvel Davis was the other would-be assassin, and he told a couple people that Joseph Smith had indeed recruited him to kill Grandison Newell. So this is not actually as new as it sounds during the Missouri period. And that's why I say that some of the ethos of the Danites was there prior to that period.
All right. Okay. So that pushback was well absorbed, and I totally agree with you. When I discussed that on the show, you'll have to forgive me. I'm going to pull up which episode it was real quick. That I considered that was essentially a turning point when it comes to Joseph and Sidney Rigdon. That's when they turn from being just, idle leaders of a religious cult into like mob bosses, right? Because if they're ordering hits of somebody that's raising up claims against them, essentially suing them all the time, that's that's essentially that's a big problem. Yeah, episode 39 we covered it. It's titled Joseph Smith's Assassination Order, because that Grandison Newell guy, he posed a big problem for Joe and the leadership of the church. And whether or not Joe actually did command these guys to kill that guy or, sit outside of his house and kill him, the fact that the rumors were circulating that he was that Joe had claimed that Joe had ordered his assassination, that was enough for public opinion, right? Just people hearing that this religious leader had commanded his people to assassinate a public official or a public entity, that's a scary thing just by itself.
Right.
So, I guess I am kind of on board. Maybe the rhetoric didn't really start in Missouri once they got chased out of Kirtland, but maybe that's where I see it was distilled or fermented, right? Maybe they had the beginnings of these apocalyptic rhetorical devices going on in Kirtland, and that might have served to be something that got them excommunicated from the Kirtland church. And maybe once they got out to Missouri, that's when they're like, all right, nobody's going to check us on this. Now we really have open season to spout this rhetorical craziness.
Yeah. I think, I think even with like the militancy, the open militancy, Joseph Smith had organized the War Department of the church, as early as Zion's Camp back in 1834. He'd marched an army to Missouri basically to redeem Jackson County. So this was not new stuff, but I do think that he's finally sort of so enraged and so emboldened after being expelled from Kirtland that he just decides to kind of go all in on this militancy. And they set up the Danites, and they basically swear everybody to kind of absolute obedience to the church leaders, and they implement the law of consecration where people are signing over all of their property to the church. And if you don't do that, then you're in big trouble and basically threatened with violence. Once you've signed over all your property to the church, then you either stay or you lose everything, because they were not giving the property back. Right. Joseph Smith, has this revelation that says kind of apostates don't get their consecrated property back, and kind of calls it, I forget the exact words that he used, but the property of the Gentiles will be consecrated to the house of the Lord, or something along those lines. And basically, justifying taking property from apostates in order to fund the kingdom. And so it was no small matter for people like W.W. Phelps or Orson Hyde to turn against Joseph Smith during this period. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Big. Yeah, and I think, Oliver Cowdery being up on the stand and saying that, Yeah, I'm paraphrasing essentially, but, delivering the sentiment that church and state are too intermingled, that the church authorities shouldn't have power to tell me what to do with my property. I think that probably alienated a lot of people, saying, give us all your stuff and we'll distribute it as we see fit. Especially because so many of the saints, especially refugees from Ohio and Canada and whatnot, they didn't have anything with them. They didn't have anything to consecrate to the church. So, yeah, it's this resource vacuum that I see that was a huge problem for Missouri.
Right. Yeah, it was bad. I mean, they were really poor, and they had invited everybody to gather to Missouri, and they didn't have the crops to support everybody. So if you read, I don't know if you've ever read William Schwartzel's memoir of this period.
I've seen a couple of references to it, but I haven't read the whole thing yet.
You've got to read the whole thing. It is so revealing about the Danites, but also about, just the ethos during this period, the kind of everybody in the community is kind of watching each other and listening to each other and reporting on each other. So it's it's very Orwellian, but it also shows you why they were so desperate. I mean, everybody was starving in the community, and the only way that, because they had all turned over their resources to the church, the only way that you could get food was if you kind of towed the party line and got assigned to some work by the church leaders so that you could, get food rations. So it really was a controlling and desperate situation for the Mormons during this period. And Schwartzel was not happy about it from the beginning. He hated what was going on, but he basically towed the party line because that's what you had to do.
And then, of course, as things became more and more desperate, as winter was nearing, they had to resort to essentially looting in order to just sustain themselves. I mean, they began appropriating people's crops and their cattle and whatnot for the purpose of the church, for forwarding the kingdom. I mean, during the siege of DeWitt, I know that the Mormons that were there that couldn't leave the town because they would be essentially arrested by the opposing militia, they just waited until some local hogs and cattle just wandered into DeWitt and took them, appropriated them, even though they were the property of the other Missourians that were there. And they considered it like manna from heaven, because in this time when we were, extremely starved, we're so hungry, there's an opposing militia out there that won't even let us leave, we're under siege. God must have sent these cattle here to help us survive, even though it was essentially stealing. But if they wouldn't have done it, they would have died. So we have to factor in the desperation into all of the actions that the Mormons and especially the leadership was taking at this time. Because if you remove that, I mean, that's a huge variable to take out of the equation.
Yeah, it's a really underappreciated aspect, just how desperate they were. And it's not like all of the followers of Joseph Smith just wanted to go out and loot Gentile towns or steal from them. They felt that they really needed to.
Yeah.
But, of course, that's not to exonerate the leaders, because the leaders kind of created the situation by encouraging so many people to come there in the first place. So
commanding. I think encouraging is too soft of a word for it. It was a revelation that we must flee as soon as possible, essentially. That was divine decree, in my opinion.
Yeah, and if you look at, the situation of the people who remained in Kirtland after Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon left, things were simmering a little bit. There was still some conflict, but it was not that bad. They could actually have stayed there, and the people who came in Kirtland Camp, there was about 500 members of Kirtland Camp who came over several months after Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon. Those people could have stayed in Kirtland and remained very comfortable, but instead they subjected themselves to this sort of extreme journey, basically because they were commanded to do so.
Well, and they were only commanded to do so because Rigdon and Joe had essentially pissed off everybody in Kirtland enough that they were running for their lives. I mean, they fled in the middle of the night to avoid detection. if they could have gotten past the so-called persecution that was going on, maybe they could have stuck around. But I see it that if Joe and Rigdon would have remained in Kirtland, I think Carthage never would have happened because somebody would have gotten to Joe a lot earlier.
Yeah, well, what I mean is Joseph and Rigdon definitely needed to flee, but everybody else didn't need to flee. Like,
okay, true.
Joseph and Rigdon were out of the picture, then the situation was basically manageable. And the Mormons who remained loyal to Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon were more or less getting along with the dissenters after Joe and Rigdon left. So
incredible. I just find it so fascinating that, you take these two people out of the equation and everybody's cool. And I wonder how much of the troubles that they experienced in Missouri wouldn't have been the case if you removed those two people from the equation too. Like, if they weren't spewing this doomsday rhetoric from the pulpit, talking about a war of extermination and whatnot, if they just simply wouldn't have done that, I would like to think that their time in Missouri probably wouldn't have been quite as, wouldn't have been quite as confrontational as it was in 1838 there.
Right. I mean, they had experienced some confrontations before, but it had never come to this sort of violence. And what's interesting is how fast the situation changes after Joseph and Rigdon arrive. It's like,
oh yeah,
it flips so fast because the leaders who were there before had actually worked out a pretty nice accommodation with the Gentiles, where the Mormons were going to, stay in Daviess County, and they had that county, or Caldwell County, and they had that county all to themselves. Yeah. And the Gentiles were going to allow that. And then Joseph Smith and Rigdon come in, and they basically say, we're not going to stay in Caldwell County, we're going to expand to Daviess County. And they kind of throw out all the agreements that the previous leaders had made with the Gentiles. And, and then they start preaching this really militant rhetoric and, trying to influence the election with block voting and, just all kinds of behavior that the Gentiles just considered a betrayal of their agreements and intolerable. So,
well, and you factor in the use of the Danites, to surround Judge Adam Black's house. Yeah. That's scary stuff. Like, I can't even imagine what that might look like today. I gave the example of, say somebody with a foreign sounding name and a non-Christian religion moves into one of the Plains states today and leads an armed militia to surround a judge's house in order to get them to sign something under duress. That wouldn't fly today, right? I mean, they'd be surrounded by tanks in seconds.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, trying to capture what was the public feeling at the time, there's simply no way to understand that. Yeah.
It was a very different world back then. I mean, they didn't have a central army that could go out and deal with stuff like this. So you get rogue mob violence all over the place in early America. I mean, there's a book titled Rioting in America, and it's really informative about just how common this stuff was. So it's not like it was just the Mormons by any means. It was super, super common. People were basically just out making their own rules and enforcing it through extra-legal vigilante violence and through semi-legal state militia violence of all kinds. Right. So I don't want to be too hard on the Mormons, but.
Oh, well, yeah, but it was coming from both sides, too. Like,
oh, absolutely.
I've seen these accounts that when rumors were spreading that this many people died in the Gallatin Election Day battle and, this many people were taken prisoner by the Mormons and killed and, like, all of these rumors that none of them were true. And you have militias that were rising up to answer to the rumors. And then when committees are appointed by Boggs or by Atchison or whoever to go and investigate who was actually at fault, everybody came back and was like, the Mormons, they're acting in self-defense. Like, the mobs are the ones that are marching on the Mormon towns and setting up their own, extra-legal vigilante militias. And that was, it's like, when you're drunk on a Friday night, like, you don't have TV or friends to go hang out with. You go form a mob, right? It's like, are you mad about something? Yeah, I'm mad about something. Yeah, let's go out and march. Get your pitchforks, right? I mean, It was more of a pastime from the way that I see it than anything else.
Right. If you look at, abolitionism, for example, there's abolitionists who get driven out of state after state after state, and their printing presses get burned, 5 or 6 times. And,
just like the Mormons.
This is just how you lived if you had radical views.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
And we complain now when a YouTube channel gets shut down because, a copyright infringement or whatever. It's like, nah, we got it pretty good nowadays. At least there isn't, a 400 strong army standing out in front of your house saying that you need to leave and burning your printing press.
Right.
It's incredible stuff. 1838 is confusing as it could possibly be. But I'm curious about Danites themselves specifically, kind of more about the specific organization of it, because I've heard like Porter Rockwell is Joe's destroying angel, or, Mormonism's destroying angel. But then I've also heard like he was just head of the squadron that was called the destroying angel. And there were like these certain squadrons that were named specific things led by General Lyman White or Samson of Art or whatever. Can you shed some light on kind of the organizational structure of the Danites for us?
Yeah, so Jared Carter was the first captain general when the Danites were organized. And then about July, he gets in trouble because he complained to Joseph Smith about something that Sidney Rigdon had said. And Joseph Smith puts him on trial right away before the first presidency in the High Council and basically charges him with finding fault with the presidency because the Danites were supposed to obey absolutely everything that the presidency said. And so Carter actually gets removed as captain general, and Joseph Smith says that his punishment should have been death according to Danite principles, and that he would have cut Carter's throat on the spot if he'd been alone when he made the complaint.
Holy shit!
And Dim McHuntington also says to Reed Peck that at the trial Carter came within a finger's point of losing his head. So Joseph Smith strips Carter of his rank and appoints Elias Higbee as the new captain general of the Danites. Wow. And then you have, several officers, and I don't recall all of the offices, but I know that there's people like Dimmick Huntington was one of the officers, and I don't remember the others, but so anyway, then later they form a bunch of companies, and among the companies is one called the Destructionists, and And the Destructionists were tasked, if the Gentiles continued to come after them, the Destructionists were supposed to go and actually burn Richmond, which was the capital of one of the counties in Missouri.
Yeah.
And they also discussed actually poisoning the water supply.
What?
So, yeah. And so the Destructionists were one of the companies. That's possibly where the term destroying angel comes from. But that term destroying angel is actually a really obscure term, and it's hard to pinpoint exactly the origins of that term. It does get used occasionally through this period, but it's much more common later in Utah. So,
wow.
But it's a biblical allusion because in Exodus, when the plagues are being enacted on the Egyptians, it calls the angel that enacts those plagues the destroyer. Actually, I think it's the plague against the firstborn sons. It says the destroyer went from house to house, but it passed over the houses of the Israelites. And I think that's basically where the term destroying angel comes from, is that passage.
Oh. Interesting. Yeah, because if you look at a picture of Porter Rockwell, nothing about him is cherubic whatsoever. So, yeah, that's being a blib, an allusion to a Bible passage, that makes perfect sense because these guys lived, ate, and breathed the Bible. Where else would it come from? Interesting.
Yeah,
so the Danites
they did was a biblical allusion.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, including the Book of Mormon itself, fan fiction, I guess. So the Danites, they were never officially disbanded, ever, were they?
No. In fact, we find very strong Danite echoes in Utah. And some of my friends think that when people talk about Danites in Utah, that this is sort of an exaggeration. But I actually think there was probably some still formal or semi-formal Danite activity going in Utah. So Schwartzel describes how the Danites were supposed to carry around these leather whips with weights inside in order to beat dissenters. And we actually have examples in Utah of dissenters or apostates being beaten with leather whips with weights on the end. So they still seem to have been doing the same things in Utah that they were doing in Missouri. And also in
why
Nauvoo.
wouldn't they? Right?
Yeah, I mean, they'd sworn oaths to do it, and those oaths were never, repealed. They were never really released from those oaths. So, yeah, it makes sense that they would have considered themselves still sort of under those obligations.
Now, what would you say to a person claiming that Danites exist in some form of their old vestige even today?
I have seen claims like that, and they're fun. I don't think there's any reason to think that, but it's, it's fun to sort of imagine. Who knows? Da Vinci Code type stuff. Right?
That's my thoughts. Is like, I mean, maybe not walking around with, with whips that have, weights in them, but maybe walking around with, a black card or something, a black credit card that has, an endless well of funds to it. I could see that as being the case. But, that's all, like you said, it's fun. It's speculation. It's nothing more than that. Hardly any, or, no real foundation for it.
Right.
So I do want to talk more, kind of get into the meat of our conversation about the Utah years themselves, because that's what your doctoral dissertation was on. I'm going to read an abstract from it here in a second, but personally, from my own personal perspective, I haven't begun studying the Utah years intently yet. As I am producing the show, I'm doing the research for it as I produce each episode. So what the listeners have learned so far, that's what I've learned. I have not, begun studying really hard like the Liberty Jail and what went on in Nauvoo afterwards. And of course, I haven't studied the Utah years, but you, sir, are an expert on the early Utah years. And I really want to pick your brain about that. So is it cool if we switch gears real quick on the conversation?
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Okay, let me read the abstract from your dissertation real quick. It says, quote, white Mormon pioneers arrived on the Wasatch Front in 1847 and proclaimed that the land belonged to God and therefore to themselves, much like anybody with God claim, that's my promised land. No, it's mine. Whatever. From 1847 to 1851, they imposed a colonial system that systematically subjugated and dispossessed Ute, Shoshone, Goshute, Pavant, Sandpit, and Southern Paiute peoples. Settlement proceeded at a rapid pace, partly because, as religious separatists, Mormons competed for land and resources with the United States. Separatism notwithstanding, Mormon scripture reproduced and canonized white Protestant theologies of Christian empire and white supremacy. In Utah, as elsewhere throughout the West, natives experienced white settlement as catastrophic conquest and displacement. End quote. Thank you and good night. That is an amazing abstract. So, Chris, you, sir, are an expert on this subject, on what the white settlement, the Mormon settlement in Utah, and how it affected the greater geological and demographic area. Let's talk about this.
Sure.
I don't even know where to start. Just start talking. I'm so curious.
All right. Well, there's been several historians actually who have used the word conquest to describe Mormon settlement, but nobody has really told the story as a story of conquest. They've just sort of dropped that bomb and then moved on with kind of pioneer history. And occasionally you'll get a chapter here or there about Native Americans, but no kind of detailed narrative history of Mormon conquest. And so that's the gap that I set out to fill in this dissertation was, all these historians are saying it was a conquest. I want to actually tell the story as a conquest. And so that's really what I did here. And I tried to be very archival, get really deep into documents, primary documents. And I tried to write vivid narrative. And another thing that I really did here was I incorporated the story of how Mormonism was kind of a radical sectarian movement, because I think that the view of Mormons as kind of evangelicals, like not actually that radical, is still surprisingly influential in Mormon historiography. But we have, several really compelling histories that tell the story of Mormonism as radical, like going all the way back to Marvin Hill's Quest for Refuge, which was published, I think, back in the 80s, maybe late 80s, all the way down through more recently, Will Bagley and David Bigler wrote The Mormon Rebellion, about the 1857-1858 Utah War, where they rebelled against the government. You've got John Turner's Brigham Young biography, which really presents Brigham Young as kind of a radical revolutionary. And so I think that we have some historians who are exploring kind of the radical dimensions of Mormonism, but surprisingly it hasn't really made its way into the mainstream of Mormon historiography yet. And so I brought that story in a big way and talked about kind of how Mormons were colonizing Utah in competition with the government. In fact, they accelerated their conquest of the Native Americans. They accelerated their expansion because they wanted to lay claim to all of the land and resources before the Gentiles came and competed with them for it.
Right.
And so,
because Utah was a sanctuary for the Mormons. There was nobody out there that was going to check Brigham Young's power, right?
Right. And when they come west, basically Utah was still part of Mexico when they originally come west. It very quickly gets incorporated into the United States because, of course, there was the Mexican-American War, and Mormons even participated in that war as the Mormon Battalion. And they annex Utah to the United States as part of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. That happens in 1848. But when the Mormons come across the plains in 1847, they're coming into Mexico. They're leaving the United States. And they actually are very excited to be leaving the United States. They express how happy they are to finally be beyond the reach of the nasty Gentiles. And that kind of encapsulates the attitude that the Mormons have toward the U.S. government throughout this period. They occasionally cooperate with the U.S. against natives, but they're always suspicious that the Gentiles are plotting against them. When John Gunnison comes through, they have a long powwow with John Gunnison where he has to really reassure them that he's not going to do anything to try and take the land from them. And Brigham Young sends spies. He assigns people to Gunnison's company to help out and kind of presents it as, he's being generous, but actually he's installing spies in Gunnison's company to watch him and make sure that he's not doing anything untoward. So,
dude, that is a brilliant. Okay, like, the more I study Mormon history, the more I see Brigham Young as like the ultimate comic book villain, but only real. He was an actual person, and he did some things that no comic book villain could ever dream of doing. One of which might be termed as the Mountain Meadows Massacre, but just wiping out so many colonies of Native Americans. I guess that's an aspect of Brigham Young I've never really thought much about until we talk about like the Timpanogos Indians or like the Wasaki Indians, like all of these people that were just wholesale massacred because Mormon, yay! Because there's, I understand that was kind of the trend of the American politic at the time, but even so, like, Brigham Young did stuff to white people that Bond villains wouldn't do, right?
Right. I actually, I give Brigham Young a little bit of credit here because a lot of the impetus to wipe out the natives actually came from his subordinates. And he is he kind of resists at first. Actually, he is opposed to mass violence, collective punishment. He is, yeah, and then his subordinates, like at one point, all of the male Utah Valley settlers vote to kill off the Indians. And they come to Brigham Young and they tell him, we voted unanimously to kill off the Indians. Will you give us permission to kill off the Indians? And Brigham Young all along has been saying, don't kill off the Indians. But now he's like, well, if everybody agrees, then I guess the situation is sort of beyond salvage. And so he then, once he authorizes them to go after the Indians, though, he's all in. He wants the job done. And so he tells them to... He tells them to do the job up clean, and he says basically let no hostile Indians escape. He tells them not to take any prisoners, and when they do take prisoners, they end up either poisoning off the prisoners or just shooting them down. They disarm them and they kill them.
Oh my god, dude. Oh, that's so horrible. That's horrible.
It's horrible. It was dark, actually, writing this dissertation sometimes. I mean, there is definitely ennobling moments. There's always, like, positive interactions between Mormons and natives that give you some hope for humanity. But yeah, there's some episodes in here that are just so dark that it was depressing sometimes to write this. And I feel like it was a really important story to tell because these were human beings, and every single one of them had... people who love them and hobbies that they like to do, and they were full human beings. And unfortunately, most of them we don't even know their names because nobody ever bothered to write down their names before they killed them all off. And I just it's horrible to even contemplate some of this stuff. But it's real, and we need to remember these stories.
That's probably the most important takeaway from this. I mean, the scholarship that you're doing, like you said, most people just claiming that it was a conquest, not telling the story. There's obviously a story there, but I understand, like, the historical references to these people, like, to the native tribes that were living in the Utah Territory. They didn't have their own set of chroniclers and scribes the way that Brigham Young did. So, like, where do you find some information about these groups, whether they have a name or don't, knowing that they were wiped out at this time, on this day, on this year, essentially? Where do you find some of this information?
A lot of it I found in the Brigham Young papers. So he, of course, has interpreters who are kind of authorized agents and traders to go and talk to the Indians. And actually, most people were not supposed to interact with the Indians. It was kind of illegal to do that because they didn't want whites corrupting the Indians, and they didn't want whites through sort of cultural ignorance causing problems with the Indians. And so they appointed a few interpreters to kind of handle all that business. It doesn't end up working out that way because there's just, too many Indians around, and settlers are kind of going to do their own thing. Brigham Young had a really, really hard time actually getting people to sort of subscribe to his vision of Indian relations. He tells people, for instance, to build forts for self-defense. And this is his alternative, actually, to collective punishment. He figures if we build stockades and forts and protect our crops and protect our animals, then we're not going to have any problems with the Indians. They won't be able to steal the livestock, and then punishing them for stealing the livestock won't be an issue. But the pioneers on the whole, they're just thinking about getting by from day to day and building their own homes and, farming and raising animals. And so the going and building a fort is just too much for most of them. It's asking too much for people who are just trying to get by. And so Brigham Young has a really, really hard time getting people to sign on to that vision. I don't remember what your question was now. What was I answering here?
I mean, essentially, information like this must be kind of hard to come by. I mean, you said you got a lot of it from the Brigham Young papers, but, like, where else?
Yeah, there's also territorial militia papers. So you can look at, like, the correspondence between Daniel H. Wells, who was the leader of the territorial militia right under Brigham Young. He was commander-in-chief. he has all this correspondence with his kind of generals and lieutenants and captains in the field. And so we can see, you know, their basically daily expedition reports of what they were doing. And unfortunately, a lot of that material is actually lost, but there's quite a bit still there. And so we can get, you know, a fairly detailed picture of how these battles unfolded.
Wow.
And then, of course, you have some just pioneer journals that talk about things. So one of the really interesting discoveries that I made was there's this famous Nephi massacre where Indians killed some white settlers, and it's kind of gone down in history as an Indian massacre. But I discovered that actually in a pioneer journal there's a report of Mormons massacring some Sandpit Indians shortly before that. So the native
response
act, it seems to have been an act of retaliation when the natives killed the whites.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah. So anyway, it was really a productive research effort, and I think I discovered a lot of just neat little details. I don't know that, you know, I proposed some grand new theory that's going to change our understanding of culture or anything, but as far as just like getting into, you know, historical details and revealing things about just the day-to-day lives, how these battles unfolded and what was going on, the personalities involved. Brigham Young and the Ute leaders each had their own distinctive personalities and why they behaved the ways they did. I think I got into some of those issues and, you know, showed how, for instance, the Mormons basically installed Wakara, who was this fairly brutal native leader. The Mormons basically backed him as a leader of all the native tribes in Utah because Wakara was willing to work with them, and Wakara was strongman enough to sort of keep everybody under control, and it was way easier to deal with one man than it was to deal with a bunch of, you know, little bands and petty leaders. And so basically Brigham Young, you know, gives this guy a whole bunch of gifts, and with his resources, he's able to control people, keep the other tribes in line for Brigham Young. And so, you know, Wakara was a bad guy. He engaged in a lot of violence. He even, there's a pretty horrific account of him, like, beating his own mother and basically deciding it was her time to die. And
dude,
and, you know, he did things like he would kill prisoners as sacrifices when one of his prominent warriors died, and so they'd kill horses and prisoners in order to accompany the person into the afterlife. So he was a pretty brutal guy, but it's not like this was, you know, reflective of all natives or what all natives wanted. It's basically just, you know, he was a powerful figure on the scene before Brigham Young arrived, and Brigham Young made him even more powerful.
And it sounds like him and Brigham Young probably got along with their, let's say, business-minded perspective of things.
For a while, they did, yeah.
Man, that's incredible.
Along. And then,
so for a while,
they fought a war.
there we go. Now we're talking.
Yeah,
Okay.
So I think actually that this is fairly common with kind of narcissistic personalities, which, by the way, I don't think Brigham Young started out that way, but I think he ends up sort of developing a narcissistic personality through
I disagree with you.
Well, we'll have to talk about that sometime.
Okay, anyway,
yeah.
Sorry, yeah. Didn't want to derail it.
But anyway, I think that narcissistic personalities tend generally to be drawn to each other, and then they tend to have falling outs because basically their egos are not ultimately compatible. But they sort of recognize each other initially as kindred spirits, and they recognize that they can help each other out, and that lasts for a while, and then they fall out. And it's a pattern that we see throughout Joseph Smith's lifetime, and I think also throughout Brigham Young's lifetime.
Interesting. I definitely agree with that. Being the alpha male perspective of Brigham Young, the narcissistic perspective. He was the leader. He was the divine leader, the governor, the everything of Utah. And, I understand from just a strictly managerial perspective, if you keep having people coming in and trespassing and stealing your junk, you're going to do whatever you can to stop them from doing that. And I tend to see that probably played a little bit into Brigham Young's perspective of how he wanted to handle the natives. I mean, if he can't control the problem, you know, if he can't put out all the fires, it's just like, all right, let's just burn them all, right? I mean... Yeah. And one of the things that you have to understand about this period is that Mormons and natives had completely different conceptions of private property, right? So natives basically see the land. They have kind of their homeland. Each band has a homeland that it inhabits. And they'll sort of range out into other people's homelands, but they have agreements with those other groups that let them sort of use some of the resources in that area. And then the other group can come into their homeland and use some of the resources there. But there's no individual property. Yeah, right? Like ownership wasn't really a thing. Yeah, right. So then the Mormons come in and they have a conception of property that's rooted in natural rights and John Locke's philosophy. Mm-hmm. And basically what John Locke says is the land and the resources in it are all common property. They belong to all of humanity until somebody comes in and mixes labor with the land or with the resources in order to improve it into something. And by mixing your labor with something in the commons, that resource or that land becomes yours. And so basically the conception among farmers on the frontier was that you have to farm land in order to claim it, right? You have to build fences and houses in order to claim that land. The trees are, free for the taking, but they become yours once you fashion them into houses or tools or fences. And so when they arrive on the frontier, they basically see the land as empty and unowned because some of the natives engaged in farming, but for the most part, these were not farmers. Nomadic. So the Mormons viewed the land as unimproved and therefore unowned, and they just, start taking it. And when the natives ask for payment for the land, the Mormons actually refuse. They say that the land belongs to God, and to our God, not your God, payment. Our God.
Yeah, right.
Well, and it seems like an extension of the entire colonialist nature of, white expansion into the frontier America, right? I mean, it's not just Mormons. Everybody was doing this. Like, you get to somewhere, you squat on that land, it is your property. You improve that land as your property. So, I can't find fault with the Mormons, but I can find fault with the colonialist perspective in general, because it's just... Well, obviously, people like the natives that have been here for 15,000 years just got screwed over. That's it. That's what happens when you have somebody that comes in and says, this is mine now. Yeah, it's yours because you have fire sticks and we have arrows.
Right. And because of, massive depopulation due to disease. I mean, basically, the native population was reduced by 80 to 90% through disease in very few years. And so basically... there's not many people left to put up a fight. And in fact, during the 1850 Timpanogos War, where all the Mormon settlers voted to kill off the Utes were in the middle of a measles plague. So half of their warriors are behind those barricades, dying of measles. So...
Yeah, I'm convinced that expansion into frontier America wouldn't have been quite as easy if 90% of the warriors had been wiped out already.
Yeah, and you just think about not just the loss of personnel, right, but the loss of knowledge. Like,
my God, right?
They don't have books, right? So they just have experts who are passing down knowledge from generation to generation. But if you lose 90% of your population, then 90% of your experts are gone. And so now all of that knowledge that you've accumulated is lost. And
that doesn't even say anything for the people that are left behind that now have to deal with civilizations that have been depopulated by 90%. Where do you put all the bodies? Where do you start farming in order to build up sustainability again? Oh crap, here are the whites with their fire sticks here to kill us anyway, so I guess it doesn't matter anymore, right? I mean, it's like,
and how do you
horrible.
how do you deal with the climate change? Because remember, the whites are coming in and they're radically changing the environment. So they're diverting all the waterways in Utah into their fields. And these were fishing cultures often. These natives relied every year on the fish that came down the rivers. And some of them were farmers. They did farm. And you get things like Mormons building upstream from a Paiute settlement and siphoning off all the water. So there's no water left for the Paiute farms downstream. And so, yeah, they're having to deal with all of this stuff. And basically, they probably all have post-traumatic stress disorder. I mean, this is probably like a severely traumatized culture because of everything that they've been through.
Yeah, because all of their friends and all of their family have either died indirectly through measles or smallpox or whatever, or have died directly at the hands of the white settlers. Like, that's just the harsh reality of it. Every single Native American living there knew somebody or was related to somebody who had been negatively affected or had been killed by the whites. Simple as that.
Right. And it wasn't just everybody knew somebody. It was like most of the people that they knew, right? So the Mormons go down and they meet the Paiutes for the first time. And the refrain that they hear again and again from the Paiutes is already before they even met the Mormon settlers, they say, we have no families because they've all died of measles and smallpox.
Oh, man.
So, yeah, it was brutal. And the other thing that was going on was the Spanish had introduced the slave trade. And
Okay. This was a whole separate topic I really wanted to ask you about, because I have heard a couple of times that Utah was essentially the center of Native American slave trading in America. Is there a basis for that? Is there a foundation for that claim?
At this time, it was probably New Mexico. There had definitely been slave trading in the eastern United States, back during like the colonial period. But at this time in the western United States, it was sort of the Southwest. It was New Mexico, Utah, and California. And the center was probably Santa Fe, Abiquiu, that area. But those traders would come up into Utah and they would offer guns and horses in exchange for basically prisoners of war. So the native tribes would raid each other. I shouldn't use the word tribes because that's kind of a Euro-American word. They weren't really organized as tribes, but they were raiding each other and then taking prisoners of war and selling them to the Spanish traders. And some of the people were so desperate, basically, that in order to keep their children from being taken from them, they would sell their children directly to the Spanish slavers in order to basically get enough, get horses and guns so that they could feed themselves,
Dude.
So yeah, it was brutal. You had a massive depopulation. If you look at the gender balance in the sources, you get descriptions, for instance, of like 40 men and say 9 or 10 women in a single group, because women were more in demand than men as slaves, because basically women are sort of being used for sexual purposes by their owners, and also they're sort of easier to train. I think they were kind of less threatening than a male slave. And so you get massive female depopulation, massive depopulation of the children. Kind of they're selling off the entire next generation. And
of course, all the Mormon polygamists are like, no, we need them.
Yeah, well, the Brigham Young basically authorized missionaries to go marry native wives. But he forbade,
that actually happened?
Yeah. It didn't happen a lot because the people, his followers, were not really enthusiastic about the idea for the most part. But he did authorize them to do that. In fact, instructed some people to do that. So that was a thing. And on the flip side, Native men were not allowed to marry Mormon women. That was kind of against Brigham Young's racial doctrine.
Of course.
So you have this overabundance of Native men who, don't have, they kind of can't raise families, right? Because there aren't enough women to go around. And they're not allowed to marry Mormon women. And I think there's some research suggesting that when you have an overabundance of men who are unemployed in a culture, that it kind of leads to more violence and it leads to more warfare in the culture. So that probably contributes to some of the conflicts.
Wow. So this year, I attended the Seattle Sunstone Symposium, and I'll go back to that in a second. But at this symposium, Thomas Murphy was the keynote presenter. I don't know if you're familiar with his work at all.
Oh yeah, he wrote a fabulous dissertation on the Book of Mormon. Well, he goes beyond the Book of Mormon, but he really penned one of the best analyses of kind of race doctrine in the Book of Mormon that's available out there right now.
I need to look into that. But this was my first exposure to his work at all. And the title of his presentation was Rejecting Racism in Any Form, Latter-day Saint Rhetoric, Religion, and Repatriation. And essentially, seeing this, I shared this a little bit in the Lindsay Hansen interview that I had a couple weeks ago, but seeing his presentation basically shattered my entire foundation of knowledge in history, because every bit of history, he essentially made the point that every history that I've read has been written by white men about other white men. But like, personally, you, Chris, your dissertation obviously taps into this huge subsect of scholarship that we're essentially ignorant on, because there's a whole other side of the history that we just simply don't know about. There just simply isn't record for. Like so many of these native tribes that were just completely exterminated, carte blanche, destroyed by white settlement. Like, they didn't have any stories written about them. They didn't have any scribes. They didn't, many of them didn't have names. As you said, the people that were killing them didn't bother to ask their names before they killed them. Like, it makes me understand, like, there's so much of this history that I just, not only am I completely ignorant of, but the entire historical society surrounding Mormonism seems completely ignorant of. The whole, like, everything about this is all just white people writing about white people, but we're missing such a huge piece of the puzzle. And, seeing Thomas Murphy's presentation and now hearing about your dissertation, it's like, I'm glad this scholarship is finally being done, or, at least being opened up and introduced into the public mind, because, like, these are topics worth discussing. These are real people. Like you said, they had hobbies, they had a day-to-day life, and they're just exterminated without a single word of print being written about them. I see that as an utter tragedy to the historical record.
It is. And I should give credit where credit's due. I mean, there's Jared Farmer wrote a great book about Mormons and natives, and W. Paul Reeve wrote on this subject a few times. And also there have been occasionally some native historians who have chimed in, like Ned Blackhawk, and Elise Boxer has talked about it. I don't know if she's actually written anything that's gotten published on the subject. So there's work being done, but there's so much more work to do. And right. I'm glad to contribute a little bit to the literature and kind of bring this stuff to light. And I suffer from being a white man. I definitely have my own biases, and right. Unfortunately the sources are really sparse. And so, even with all of the effort I put in to tell the story of Native people, my dissertation is to a great extent the story of white Mormons and the violence that they perpetrated against Native people, right? Because I can't tell what the sources don't say, right? I'm really limited by the availability of information. And so, I feel bad not being able to give biographical information on the victims, but when it's not available, I'm kind of constrained.
Well, even you said yourself, I mean, was it in retaliation, the Timpanogos Indian, or the Sandpit Indians, I think you said, that there, what was seen as a massacre, you found through this journal, this, undiscovered journal, it was actually a retaliation strike. Like,
Right.
I come from pioneer stock. There are some listeners of this show that come from pioneer stock. You know what? Some of your grandparents may have these journals hiding in a chest in their attic or something. Dig through them. See what we can find, because who knows, one passage out of a journal might completely alter our perspective of a so-called massacre or a battle that happened, and frame it in, this larger, greater Indian Mormon conflict that, it seems like we're only just now starting to really gain a grasp on.
Yeah.
And maybe that's, okay, so maybe that's just an amorphous open petition to have the listeners go digging through their grandparents' treasure chests. But still, like you said, there is work that needs to be done. This is not, we don't have a full grasp of it. We're just barely scratching the edge of the iceberg right now. We're only beginning to understand this insane, massive body of knowledge that doesn't exist yet. This it seems like almost an opening body of scholarship that's only been embarked upon in the last decade or so.
Right.
And I suppose that's kind of my way of saying thank you for doing this dissertation. I saw pictures on Facebook of you like coddling and, feeding your dissertation before you were going into your defense about it. Like you've obviously put a lot of work into this. I personally haven't read it yet, and I look forward to reading it someday. But obviously this is a body of scholarship that needs more people studying in it. And if you're a college student wondering if you want to go into historical studies, there's a place for you. If you want to study Mormonism, there's a place for you. It's a growing body of scholarship that needs more people, and it needs more work and scholarship done. But that being said, Chris, I've had you on for a while, and this has been an extremely enlightening conversation. I'm definitely going to ask to have you back on the show once we start to get into the Utah years, because it seems like there's a wealth of knowledge you can offer there that I have yet to even look into. But the first place that I ever saw you, interestingly enough, this was on a Google Hangout video of the Thoughts on Things and Stuff, Jonathan Streeter that does that podcast. And this was the video that I watched was you and him going through the South Park episode and basically deconstructing every single historical claim that the episode makes. And it's brilliant. It's an amazing, amazing show that you guys put together. So of course there will be links for that in the show notes. And then you and I, that was the first video I saw. Then I saw you with Thinker of Thoughts along with Dan Vogel talking about Joseph Smith and early Mormonism. And I mean, your work and your eloquence is just endlessly fascinating to me. And then I had the opportunity to actually meet you at Sunstone in Salt Lake this year, which was amazing because you moderated a panel discussion about Book of Mormon authorship with, you'll have to remind me the names. There's Sandra Tanner. I think Mark Thomas was one of them. And then two other people. Do you happen to remember them?
Brant Gardner was on the panel.
Brant Gardner. Okay. He was the Hebrew scholar. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. And David Bokovoy.
Oh, David Bokovoy. Okay. So yeah, it was just an amazing discussion. And I'm pretty sure that discussion is up in the the Sunstone Symposium podcast feed. So honestly, like Chris, I'm seeing you more and more everywhere as I'm getting more into this body of scholarship and studies myself. I'm only, I'm less than half a decade into it myself, but it seems like everything you touch just it turns to amazing scholarship. Everywhere you go, there's just amazing stuff to find out about Mormonism. So if people do want to find you, if people want to read some stuff that you've written, where can somebody go to get in touch with you or find stuff that you've worked on?
I administer a blog called Worlds Without End, and I have written a number of really great blog posts. I think if people want to Google my blog post on costume drama in the early Mormon endowment ceremony, that's a great place to start. I think that's one of my favorite things that I've written. It's all about how W.W. Phelps used to dress up like the devil, wear costumes, and they used to use, they'd hang grapes on trees in order to serve as the fruit in the Garden of Eden, and then Phelps would sort of ride. He would do a serpent act where he would like writhe on the floor. So it's a fun piece, and also I'm on academia.edu where I've uploaded a lot of my my professional papers that I've written, so people can find me on there as well.
Awesome. That is fantastic. So, Dr. Chris Smith, now, Doctor, you finished your defense. You have that amazing PhD you've been working for so long. Thank you so much for coming on to this podcast. And I really look forward to talking to you about this kind of stuff in the future.
Thank you so much, Bryce. It's been fun.
Absolutely. And that is it for my interview with Christopher Smith. Once again, I really want to thank him for coming on and for just being so open and sharing so much of his knowledge with us. Just had so much fun. Anytime I get to shoot the shit with somebody that really knows Mormon history, I can't get enough of it. That's why the conversation was so long. But of course, we can't end the episode yet because we have a new segment.
It's time for Mormon Mimsies.
If I show you something, promise you won't tell?
Like a secret? Really? Cool.
This is the Mormon Mimsies segment. Now, what we're doing here is each week I'm going to read a quote to you guys. It could be from a Mormon or from a non-Mormon. It could be from 180 years ago. It might be from last week. That's the fun of it. And of course, the first person who guesses where it's from gets a shout out on the next episode when we read the next Mimsy for the next week. So, going to have this be a recurring weekly segment. Here is your Mormon Mimsy for today. Quote, Joseph then went to Palmyra, and, said he, I there met that damn fool Martin Harris, and told him that I had a command to ask the first honest man I met with for $50 in money, and he would let me have it. I saw at once, said Joe, that it took his notion, for he promptly gave me the 50, end quote. All right, so there's a quote for you. Now, the reason I'm including this quote is because I saw a video where Christopher Smith, the guest of this episode, was talking about this story where Joe met Martin and said, hey, God told me the first honest man I meet is going to give me $50. Well, I heard that story and it seemed a little too sensational, so I had to ask him, Chris, where did you get that? I've never heard that story before. And he told me. So, let's see how long it takes you guys to find it. Where do we find this quote? Of course, you can go to the Facebook page or onto the Twitter, and there will be a snapshot of this quote. I'd love to get a little bit of correspondence back from you guys. For the Mormon Mimsy segment, of course, hashtag it so I can find people that are talking about it. M-Mimsy, Mormon Mimsy, M-Mimsy. Hashtag it so, with your guess of who gave the quote or where it's from. And I'd love to talk to some of you about this before next week's segment comes up. And with that, I have to go to quick listener mail. There was one email that I wanted to just discuss really quickly. It was a correction on the CC Book of Mormon episode sent in by Michael. He said, quote, no chemical weapons were fired during World War II. And I guess I'm trying to remember back to when I discussed that in the Book of Mormon episode. I believe I was talking about them using chemical weapons. I don't know if I must have said fired or else he wouldn't have put this in. But from what I understand it, I guess they just had, massive containers full of poison gas, of, mustard gas and whatnot. And they opened up the things when they were upwind. They opened up the containers when they were upwind from the front line. And then they just, the wind would carry the chemicals, from what I understand. So I think that was a semantical correction that Michael made me aware of. So thank you for sending that email in, Mike. And of course, he also sent in this amazing listener story, but I'm going to save that for the next listener stories episode. I have a few of those in the backlog, and within the next probably 2 months or so, we're going to do another Stories of the Listeners episode. So, Michael, thank you for sending in both of your emails there. It's deeply appreciated. And of course, normally I would thank new patrons, but we don't have very many, so I'm going to wait till next week. But I do want to thank our Hall of Fame patrons. These are the patrons who have been pledging either a large amount or have been pledging for a very long time and have contributed a significant amount to making this show work. So to all of you, we have Preston, Jay, Chris and Christy, Tyler, Judy, Frank, Clara, Randy, Mindy, Colette, Greg, Eric, Philip, Sean, Doug, and George. So to all of the Hall of Famer supporters at patreon.com/nakedmormonism, you guys have all been helping out for so long and have really been bearing the load, the brunt of keeping this show a full-time endeavor. So I just want to extend my deepest gratitude to all of you. Thank you so very much for doing what you do. It may be a coffee a month for you, but it's a lifestyle for me. So thank you all to all of the patrons who support the show, and especially to these Hall of Famers that were listed. In order to close up the episode for today, I did want to talk about something that Chris and I were briefly discussing at the beginning of our discussion. We talked about Richard Bushman and Chris's connection to Richard Bushman, having been his student, essentially. But this was... Essentially what happened is Richard Bushman and his wife Claudia were in a living room having a discussion with a bunch of, I assume, Mormons, and they were talking about the history of the church. It's a 2-minute clip, and it's posted on Thinker of Thoughts, which is where you will also find a couple of other videos that Chris is featured in. But the Thinker of Thoughts is the Thoughts on Things and Stuff podcast, and Jonathan Streeter does the show, and he does an amazing podcast talking frequently about Mormonism and Mormon history. It's amazing. But this is the 2-minute video that that we were referring to that I want to discuss here. I'm gonna chunk it down a tiny bit just to get the most relevant parts. But it's very important to hear what Richard Bushman says, because remember, this is somebody that's kind of been at the forefront of Mormon studies for decades now. I mean, maybe half a century. I mean, Richard Bushman is one name that anybody in Mormon history recognizes. I mean, it doesn't matter what side of the spectrum you fall on the belief spectrum, Richard Bushman is a respected Mormon historian for you. This is what he said in the living room of this discussion that happened. It was published back in July of 2016. Here it is.
Yes, I wondered. So it's, to me, a lot of the incongruity that exists now, that is giving rise to a lot of crisis of faith and doubt situations, seems to be caused, in my view, by the disparity between the dominant narrative, what I would call the orthodox narrative, which is what we learn as missionaries, what we teach, investigators, what we learn in Sunday school. And then as you get older, you kind of start to experience Mormonism in different ways. And those ways become very important to you and dear to you, but sometimes they may not jive with some of the elements of the Orthodox narrative.
Okay, so to introduce a question, the guy says a very relevant question. When we go to church when we're young, we learn a certain Mormonism, but as we get older, we learn a different kind of Mormonism that doesn't necessarily jive with our beliefs. And he's going to finish up the question here.
And so what I'm wondering is, like, in your view, do you see room within Mormonism for several different narratives, multiple narratives of religious experience? Or do you think that in order for the church to remain strong, they would have to hold to that dominant narrative?
So is there room in the history for the church to have multiple congruent narratives, or does the church have to hold to its original narrative that it's been putting out for so long in order to stay true? And I have to say, Richard Bushman absolutely knocks this question out of the park. Here is his reply.
I think for the church to remain strong, it has to reconstruct its narrative. The dominant narrative is not true. It can't be sustained.
Not true.
So the church has to absorb all this new information, or it'll be on very shaky grounds, and that's what it's trying to do. And it'll be a strain for a lot of people, older people especially. But I think it has to change.
It has to change. In order for the church to survive, it has to change because the dominant church history narrative is not true. Richard Bushman, one of the most prominent Mormon historians, known as an apologist by many, right there saying that the dominant church history narrative is false. And I mean, the best part about this is I'm staring at the video of this. This is not a quote that's been doctored or has been passed down through oral tradition and then was recorded, years later. This is a quote right here in front of us. We have the video. You can follow the show notes to a link of the video and actually watch it for yourself. Richard Bushman, the Richard Bushman, saying that the church history narrative has serious detrimental problems. I love it. This seeing Richard Bushman say this is like a canary in the coal mine, right? When you have people like Christopher Smith, who grew up Pentecostal and just heard a little bit about Mormon history and then got incredibly entrenched in the whole world that is involved with Mormon history, people from the outside get interested in the history of the church. Obviously, there's something that's drawing. I mean, there's a driving force behind whatever draws people to the Mormon history. It's too powerful for the church to ignore. The history is too compelling and interesting for them to just explain it away and not worry about people digging any deeper into what they might call anti-Mormon literature. Well, Richard Bushman, what he's saying right now would be considered anti-Mormon 10 years ago. But here he is right here, and then there are, on the right side of my screen on YouTube here, there are another, 10 videos of Richard Bushman, Fair Mormon videos of his lectures, Salt Lake Tribune, very interesting videos of him giving pieces of Mormon history and discussing it. And it's interesting now that, Bushman is actually dragging the church towards the center, towards more realism, towards a realistic narrative, even though their apostles want to point at an iPhone and say that's kind of like what the seer stone was. I mean, there seems to be a very odd disparity between the narrative that the apostles are wanting to put forward in order to keep the business afloat, as opposed to the actual church historical narrative that is true that Richard Bushman and Dan Vogel are trying to get out there and publicize. I love seeing this disparity. You wonder at what point this juxtaposition is going to force a breaking point from one of these parties. I mean, we can't continue down these parallel paths of Mormon history. One has to bend the other to its will. I don't see the church winning on this front. They don't have the history on their side, quite honestly. But yeah, of course, if you want to see that entire video, I mean, I only played a minute and a half of it. The entire video is taken, it looks like on a cell phone camera, and it's over 2 hours long, the actual whole discussion that Richard Bushman has in here. I haven't watched the whole thing, and I'm sure he says many more juicy things, but this is just the minute 30 clip that we had to extract out of here because it's amazing. And as if by some kind of serendipity, the one of the next videos on my YouTube feed is the To Young Men Only talk by Elder Boyd K. Packer and the Jeremy Runnels CES author LDS Church Court with captions posted by Thinker of Thoughts. Thinker of Thoughts is a fantastic YouTube channel, and there are amazing videos here that just take little tiny snippets that are very important to the Mormon historical timeline, or to, even current events like Jeremy Runnels' excommunication, and puts it up there for everybody to see. It's amazing. So, of course, please do check out Thinker of Thoughts YouTube page. That will, all of these videos and everything will be linked in the show notes. One thing to add real quick before shutting it down, it is official, NAMO Home Evening is happening. For anybody who doesn't know what the home evening part comes from, Mormons practice family home evening every Monday night. That's their night to like get together and scripture read and stuff and just like be with the family. So we're doing NAMO Home Evening. Now, these are going to be probably monthly segments because we got to our Patreon goal. Thank you so much, patrons. And we're starting this on February 6th. Now, originally it was planned for January 30th, upcoming here in just a couple of days, but that wasn't enough time to announce it and get the word out to everybody. So on February 6th, we're going to be hosting the NAMO Home Evening, which is going to be a live Google Hangout available to all the patrons. Marie Kent, my wonderful co-host from My Book of Mormon podcast, will also be joining us, and hopefully she'll bring some of the listeners of that show along with us, and we'll just send out a link to all of the people who support on patreon.com an hour before we start the hangout, and that'll be your link to join in the hangout. It might be Marie and I just talking to a void, to nobody the whole night, or it might be absolute pandemonium with way too many people. I just have no idea what to expect yet. This is the first time we're doing it, and of course, as we do it, our first time, we're going to kind of work out the kinks and figure out the best way to continue doing these things from here on forward. And of course, we're going to have a couple of topics to discuss just so we aren't bored at any point. We have something to get into. So we're going to start that at 6 Pacific time. Now, I know for you on the East Coast, that's a little bit late, but that's kind of about the earliest that we can start it for those of us that are on the Pacific side, myself included. So 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, 9 o'clock Eastern, we're going to start NAMO Home Evening on February 6th, 2017. If you're hearing this in the backlog, it doesn't matter to you. Be looking out for newer episodes to hear of upcoming NAMO Home Evenings. But for those who are listening and caught up, I really hope to see some of the patrons there. I'd really like to talk to you face-to-face, or as best as face-to-face can get with Google Hangouts. So thank you all to the patrons who made it possible for us to make this NAMO Home Evening happen. Now, our next goal, of course, on Patreon is to put out censored episodes. I know that some people do not like the ramblings and the cussing and the ranting, so we'll be, if we get to that next Patreon goal, we'll be dropping censored episodes from the backlog, just the historical episodes in their own podcast feed, so it's just the history. No ranting, no nicknames, none of that bullshit. So if you want to see that happen, pledge to support at patreon.com. We'll see how it goes from here. But that's everything, all of the business we needed to conduct tonight, and it's time to shut it down for the evening. In order to do that, I need to thank a few people. We'll start off by thanking Demonista for running the Facebook page. Thank you for doing that. Need to thank Craig Keeling for providing the artwork that's used in this show. Please go to his blog at weirdmormonshit.com. Need to thank Jason Camo for providing the music that's used in the show with his permission. You can go to aloststateofmind.com to listen to his music and download it there. If you'd like to leave a voicemail to be played in the next show, you can leave it at 864-NAKED-MO or 864-625-3366. Legal counsel is provided by the law offices of P. Andrew Torres. Be sure to listen to opening arguments to get a taste of his amazing knowledge. And of course, I need to thank all the patrons who support the show at patreon.com/nakedmormonism. If you pledge to support $1 or more per episode, you get access to exclusive content available to patrons only, like an extra 20-minute discussion between Chris and I talking about Joe being drunk and high all the time. So there's a bunch of extra content there for those who do support the show, and I want to thank all of you for doing so. But most of all, I need to thank all of the listeners out there who can scarcely be described by meaningless platitudes for lending me your ear. Hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. The preceding podcast is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, all rights reserved.